The history of the Irish mob in New York's Hell's Kitchen. Part 1. The Gopher Gang and the Arsenal Mob. Hell's Kitchen, New York. An area that has become synonymous with the Irish, or more specifically, the Irish gangster. It was the exploits of Irish gangsters in Hell's Kitchen that solidified a legacy of violence and bloodshed that will forever seep into the fabric of the community. So heavily, in fact, that the mere mention of Hell's Kitchen brings back nostalgic thoughts and memories of the Irish gangsters of yesteryear, a bygone era that showcased the criminal exploits of Irish gangsters such as Owney Madden, Eddie McGrath, Hughie Mulligan, Mickey Spillane, and of course, Jimmy Coonan. Hell's Kitchen, encompassing roughly the area from 34th to 59th Streets west of 8th Avenue to the Hudson River in Manhattan, emerged as a predominantly Irish enclave following the waves of immigration driven by Ireland's Great Famine of the 1840s, with significant settlement by the mid-1850s. Irish newcomers facing widespread discrimination and limited opportunities gravitated to the neighborhoods closest to the West Side docks, where they secured grueling manual labor in longshoring, railroad construction, tanneries, and slaughterhouses. These conditions fostered dense tenement housing and chronic poverty. The abysmal, hopeless environment was a breeding ground for violence and organized crime. Economic deprivation intertwined with territorial defensiveness prompted Irish residents to informally enforce boundaries against rival ethnic groups encroaching on dock jobs or disrupting local commerce. Out of this environment arose a robust gang culture. Young Irish hoodlums would click up and form gangs based on familial bonds and neighborhood loyalties that would exert influence through extortion, loan sharking, and the regulation of gambling. But without a unified command structure or hierarchy, violence remained decentralized. But it seemed the element of unpredictability seemed to keep other ethnic gangs at bay, especially the Italian racketeers, who largely respected the Irish hold on the territory. As time rolled on, the neighborhood retained its Irish working-class character amid urban decay, with boarded-up tenements and a population drop. Despite this, youth-oriented street gangs proliferated throughout Hell's Kitchen. These gangs operated as loose alliances of relatives and friends, enforcing no-snitch codes and retaliatory justice to safeguard existing ethnic enclaves, labor unions, and ongoing rackets. One of the most violent Irish gangs that controlled the streets of Manhattan in the early 1900s and paved the way for future Irish gangsters was the Gopher Gang. The author of The Gangs of New York, Herbert Ashbury, once wrote, "The Gophers were undoubtedly the lords of Hell's Kitchen. They were fond of hiding in basements and cellars, hence their name. Every man was a thug of the first order." No story of Irish-American gangsters would be complete without a look at the Gophers, the undisputed kings of crime in Hell's Kitchen. They were the stepping stone for so many future Irish gangsters. Born in 1886, an orphan named Michael Marty Brennan was the first known Irish gang boss in Hell's Kitchen in recorded history. In the early 1900s, Brennan organized the small bands of youths that were roaming around Hell's Kitchen into one large group, which became known as the Gopher Gang. It became the largest and most powerful Irish gang in NYC, totaling about 500 members. His best friend and number two was George Gallagher, aka New Boy. They called him New Boy because he was once the new boy in the gang, and the moniker stuck. Despite being black in those days, he was highly respected in the New York underworld. This hot-tempered street fighter would often start fights that Brennan would have to finish. In one incident, he went too far and killed a man, which landed both Gallagher and Brennan in jail, even though Gallagher tried to take the blame. When he was asked, how does it feel to live in Brennan's shadow, he was quoted as saying, "Some men prefer the shadows." Brennan's former second-in-command was Frank Goo Knox. But apparently he wasn't content being second fiddle to Brennan. He tried to take over the Gophers in a failed mutiny. The unsuccessful move landed him permanently in the rival gang, the Hudson Dusters. One of the early Gopher gang leaders was John One Lung Curran. His claim to fame was a short-lived fashion trend he started. Curran was notorious for his brazen attacks on lone police patrolmen. During one such assault, he knocked the police officer out and stole his jacket. He asked his girlfriend to alter it into a smart military style, which she did, and this created a fashion fad in Hell's Kitchen. Over the next few weeks, several police officers found themselves beaten up and knocked out and relieved of their jackets, and Gophers fashionably strutted around the neighborhood in their new coats. Needless to say, police decided this was a step too far, and to avoid future humiliation, they abandoned solo patrols and began entering Hell's Kitchen in groups of 4 or 5, ending the short-lived fashion craze. And of course there was James Biff Ellison. Back then, the word biff used to mean punch or hit, and he acquired the moniker back when he was working as a bartender and he got into a street fight in which Ellison threw one punch, a haymaker, that knocked a customer unconscious who refused to pay for a beer. Despite this, he was known as a gentle giant who was more interested in business than brutality. Ellison owned several bars and gambling establishments in New York City, including a gay bar, brothel, and illegal pool halls. He himself was gay and later switched gangs and joined the 5 Points gang at the behest of his gay lover. Another notable gang member was Happy Jack Mulroney, although Happy Jack wasn't very happy. In fact, he has a quick temper and a sensitive soul. He wanted to be a professional fighter and would brawl at the drop of a hat and win, which is why the Gophers took him in. He was called Happy because of the perpetual grin he always had on his face. However, the smile was caused by a partial paralysis of the muscles in his face. He was very sensitive about his deformity. Whenever his cohorts wanted to sick him on somebody, they simply told him the guy made some slick remarks about his permanent grin. Old Happy Jack was eventually sent to prison for murder. A drinking buddy of his asked the gangster why he didn't laugh on the other side of his face, and Happy Jack wasn't amused. Instead of laughing it off, he pulled his pistol and shot him in the head. The Gopher Gang got their political clout from Silent Charles Murphy, a gang member who was also a heavyweight in Tammany Hall. Interestingly, the Gopher Gang had a female wing called the Lady Gophers, led by Battle Annie Walsh. Battle Annie was a well-known criminal who was described in the press as the Queen of Hell's Kitchen and the most feared brick hurler of her time. This notoriously tough woman was renowned for her fearlessness in battle and her strength of character. She was able to assemble a force of 50 up to a couple hundred women who, armed with clubs and knives, were used as backup members in gang fights against rival gangs and police. Walsh and her group of battle-tested women were also hired by businesses and labor unions throughout a number of violent labor disputes during the 1890s and early 1900s. Of course, I gotta save the best for last. The most well-known gopher of them all was the notorious Owney Killer Madden. A young Irishman came over from Britain at only 14 years old and was already absorbed in Manhattan's underworld. Newly initiated into the Gophers, he was desperate to prove himself, going as far as to rack up at least 5 documented murders before he turned 16. Owen Vincent Madden had to make a name for himself, and killer seemed to fit the bill. Madden was a crack shot with a revolver and equally as good with a blackjack, brass knuckles, slingshot, and one of his favorite weapons of all time, a lead pipe rolled up inside a newspaper. Owney would eventually rise into a leadership role within the gang. But after getting away with a couple of brazen murders, Madden would eventually go to prison in 1915 for orchestrating the murder of Little Patsy Doyle. Doyle was the leader of a rival Irish gang, the Hudson Dusters, a gang of drug addicts equal in size and strength to the Gophers, although their defining characteristic lies in the dust that they both used and sold. Cocaine seemed to be their calling card and their undoing. These drug-crazed lunatics would go on violent benders and were known for their wild cocaine parties in which the gang would wander the streets afterwards, all twacked out on blow, committing violent acts. One victim of these attacks was a rival gang member, Owney Madden, who was shot 6 times by Little Patsy Doyle at a dance hall. Madden survived and when questioned at the hospital, stayed true to the code and refused to talk to police. He had his own plans in mind. 3 dusters were killed the following week, but Doyle still remained breathing. Owney was quite the ladies' man, and he used 2 of his girls to lure Doyle to a cafe where he had 2 gopher hitters waiting for him, and they followed him in and then gunned him down. After serving only 7 years of a 20-year sentence, Madden was released to a much different criminal landscape in Hell's Kitchen. The Gopher Gang broke up, which was disappointing for him, I'm sure, but on the bright side, Prohibition was underway, and Owney would soon find out that he's an even better gangster as a solo artist. Madden would go on to become one of the top bootleggers in all of New York. He became an expert racketeer and a legendary gangster. He would go on to run the Cotton Club and find himself on the winning end of a violent gang war against Vincent Mad Dog Cole before hanging it up and leaving New York for Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he would cultivate a safe haven for gangsters from all over the country. Owney Killer Madden would go down as one of the top Irish gangsters of all time and the most recognizable of all the gangsters to come out of Hell's Kitchen. If Hell's Kitchen had a sweet spot for these gangsters, it would be the piers. New York City has the world's largest and busiest port with annual revenues up over $146 million or about $2 billion in today's money. Out of more than 700 miles of waterfront, over 300 have been developed into piers. The port had roughly 900 docks operating in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, along with over 100 ferry landings and tens of thousands of associated businesses, shipbuilding plants, and warehouses. The busiest docks in New York are located in the West Side piers, which are in Hell's Kitchen. 12 major railroads connected to the waterfront, trucks constantly moved in and out of the piers daily, and a quarter of Manhattan's food was brought in by boat. The port handled cargo worth an estimated $7 billion annually. Needless to say, it's a prize for any aspiring racketeer. In 1953, the New York Anti-Crime Committee stated that the city's organized criminal underworld imposed an estimated 5% tax levy, receiving a cut on every dollar's worth of cargo that went through the piers for a minimum take of $350 million each year. You can see why the Port of New York was considered sacred to the New York underworld, the gift that keeps on giving, because it has the potential to make any gangster rich beyond their wildest dreams. These piers running smoothly were essential for a thriving economy, not only in New York, but for the whole country, because it's a pivotal port of entry on the east side of the continent, and it's highly lucrative when properly exploited. And no one knows how to exploit better than these early ambitious gangsters. The first Irish gangster to organize and control the West Side piers was Eddie McGrath. Born to Irish immigrant parents, McGrath grew up in the Gas House district on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. In contrast to other gangsters of his era whose childhood typically consisted of street crime and juvie lockup, his upbringing was stable. McGrath served as an altar boy and sang in the church choir. Even though it seemed like McGrath was heading down the right path, seeing all these neighborhood gangsters dressed in nice suits and riding around in nice cars and making all that easy money seemed to have piqued his interest and pulled him into criminality. He dropped out of school after the 10th grade to work as an office clerk. Then everything seemed to change when he got a job driving a truck for Owney Madden and then Bill Dwyer. This propelled him further into criminality, and then he decided to become a full-time gangster. He started making underworld connections and began to build his own criminal network. He was arrested numerous times throughout the 1920s and 30s. He was convicted of burglary, felonious assault, arrested twice for homicide, 3 times for assault and robbery, and possession of a pistol. He would eventually take a pinch and have to serve a lengthy stretch at Sing Sing prison. His superiors and fellow gangsters respected the fact that McGrath kept his mouth shut and did his time like a man. Getting that first prison stretch under your belt was key in the New York underworld. It shows that he's solid. He can hold up under law enforcement scrutiny and keep his mouth shut. The experienced gangsters now feel he can be trusted. As soon as he was released, the notorious Joseph Ryan, the man in control of the ILA, gave him a position as an organizer for the International Longshoremen's Association on the Hell's Kitchen waterfront. He thrived as a leg-breaking goon on the docks and eventually became the primary muscle on the waterfront. Quickly became apparent to everyone that Eddie found his calling. McGrath had an intimidating demeanor and a heightened propensity for violence, so he seamlessly slid right into an enforcement role. McGrath was a born leader, and he began to build a criminal organization around him in an attempt to take over and control the docks. He built an alliance with another union guy that some thought was even more terrifying than him, John Cockeyed Dunn. The two would form a close friendship and become partners in crime, destined to take over the piers together. John Cockeyed Dunn's criminal career began in his teenage years with multiple arrests for robbery and assault. He too would be arrested twice for homicide, and would ultimately control piers 14 through 59 for McGrath. His nickname Cockeyed stemmed from his cross eyes, a trait that with most guys would invoke humor, but in Dunn's case made him more terrifying. He was eventually convicted of robbing a card game and sentenced to 2 years at Sing Sing prison in the early 1930s. During his incarceration, Dunn forged key alliances, including the one with Eddie McGrath, which propelled him into organized crime upon his release. These connections enabled his entry into waterfront rackets as an enforcer after parole. McGrath and Dunn solidified their bond when Dunn married McGrath's sister, merging their families and becoming his brother-in-law, which would help facilitate their criminal partnership. And the pair decided to take over the waterfront. They started by placing gangster allies as boss loaders to skim earnings from cargo handling and truck loading at the piers. By 1936, through their alliance with ILA President Joseph Ryan, Dunn and McGrath had secured their own union locals, enabling systematic corruption that funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars in payoffs from trucking firms and marketing businesses. Well, the legitimate union officials needed the gangsters for muscle, and McGrath and Dunn needed the unions to help maintain their operations on the piers. The mutually beneficial relationship flourished, and the mobsters counted many key labor leaders as close friends. The pair were effectively taking over the piers and several union locals, although they felt they needed one more top-tier enforcer on their squad to help enforce their will on the waterfront. And they found their man in Andrew Squint Sheridan. If McGrath's upbringing was considered stable, it's safe to say Sheridan's was not. His mother died when he was just 5 years old, and his father was unable or unwilling to look after him and his 8 siblings, and they were sent to the care of the Catholic Church. Andrew stayed at the children's home until he was 10 years old. It was during his stay at the children's home where one of the other children threw some chemicals into his face, which got into his eyes, which left him with impaired vision for the rest of his life. As he grew older, his glasses grew thicker and he earned the nickname Squint, which I'm sure wasn't used to his face too often. Due to his eye injury and lack of education, Sheridan found it difficult to find employment in traditional jobs. Couple that with his quick temper and high propensity for violence, it became clear to him that a life of crime was his calling. He got involved with the docks and recruited into the fold with McGrath and Dunn. This trifecta of terror assumed control of many of the key illegal and quasi-legal industries that were connected to the waterfront. They also muscled their way into key union positions within the ILA and the American Federation of Labor. Sheridan would be arrested once for a homicide and was convicted of attempt to escape from unlawful custody. He was pinched twice for gun possession and 3 times for robbery and larceny. He was considered the main hitman for the Arsenal mob. McGrath's top protege, who would ultimately run the day-to-day on the docks for him, was his number 2 or underboss, Hughie Mulligan. McGrath seemed to have enough enforcers. Mulligan was more of an administrator for the dock boss. Mulligan was a top New York gambling figure and bookmaker from Queens, whose main role became that of a fixer. He had an uncanny ability to corrupt law enforcement and politicians. He was New York's master puppeteer. Hughie Mulligan's ability to successfully penetrate and corrupt dozens of members of the New York Police Department was nothing short of prolific. He had close connections and friendships dating back years with many members of New York City's then Irish-dominated police force. Hughie ultimately developed and controlled a citywide bribery network. McGrath and his cronies had the West Side waterfront in a vice grip. McGrath became a prominent gangster and racketeer in New York and was considered the boss of Hell's Kitchen and the West Side Piers. He eventually became a close ally of powerful organized crime figures such as Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, and Mayor Langsky. This group is considered the inception of the Irish mob in New York, but back then they were known as the Dunn-McGrath Gang and later became known as the Arsenal Mob. They were the precursor to the Westies. The gang was active in bootlegging and other rackets, but waterfront racketeering became the signature card of the Irish mob in New York. For the next decade, McGrath, together with Dunn, Sheridan, and Mulligan, ran their unchallenged criminal organization that controlled the piers with an iron fist. Nothing moved on the waterfront without their say-so, and they had their fingers in every pie. The Irish mob also held dominant control over several other key labor unions representing a variety of industries. Through strong-arm methods that included murder, over the years, Dunn and McGrath and their men successfully intimidated, killed off, or ran all the legitimate union officials out of office and then placed their own men into those elected union offices. To maintain order, the mob's top enforcement duo, Dunn and Sheridan, were responsible for ordering or carrying out what officials say were over 30 murders, and longshoremen up and down the west side knew not to talk about their hidden overlords that oversaw their day-to-day existence. In addition to their extensive extortion and labor racketeering activities, McGrath and his cronies also controlled a huge bi-state gambling network of horse and sports bookmaking, several major floating dice games, organized cargo theft and truck hijacking rings, armed bank robbery and burglary crews, and a citywide police bribery network that underwrote it all. In fact, over the years, all these criminal rackets were made possible by the pervasive influence and control the Irish mob exerted over the NYPD and their counterparts over the bridge in New Jersey. Through a widespread bribery racket known as the Pad, they bribed and corrupted a good portion of the uniformed policemen and plainclothes detectives. This decades-long scheme also reached up to the highest levels of the department to include desk sergeants, precinct captains, division commanders, and even the top brass. It was an open scandal, first of its kind. It allowed for the Irish mob to pretty much operate unimpeded in New York City with almost total impunity for well over half a century. Dunn and Sheridan really liked that arrangement. They were able to hand out beatings and gun down rivals without a second thought of repercussion. An example of this was when an anonymous caller told the police where they could find a stash of 10 machine guns that had gone missing, like many other items of cargo that would go missing from the docks over the years. And the tip led the police to find the stash. The machine guns were Thompson submachine guns that were being shipped to the British for the war effort during World War II. This infuriated Dunn and Sheridan. They needed to find out who the snitch was, and all fingers pointed in one direction, a man named John Mutt Whitten. A few days after the weapons were found, Mutt and a few other dock workers were leaving after their shift ended, and Squint Sheridan appeared on the docks with one of his loading bosses, Joe Powell. At this point in time, Squint was a heavyweight and wasn't normally seen on the docks unless there was something important to do. So Joe Powell points out Mutt to Sheridan, who then proceeded to ask him if he could have a word. Sheridan then motioned toward a room in a storage area where they could talk privately. Mutt's mind is probably racing. He's thinking, shit, he's gonna ask me about those guns, and he's trying to get his lies straight in his head. As they entered the room, Mutt turned to speak, and as he did, he's immediately shot twice in the chest. And then, to make sure Mutt's completely done with all that talking, Sheridan walked over and stood right over him and blasted him one more time in the head. Squint then dusted himself off and walked calmly back to his car, leaving Joe Powell to clean up the mess. McGrath had no shortage of enforcers. Another heavy hitter he had on the docks was Albert Eki Ekolitis. Ekolitis was a feared member of the Arsenal gang who provided significant muscle on the docks for McGrath. As a young man, Albert got into a scuffle with a guy on the docks. McGrath happened to be looking on as Ekolitis made quick work of his opposition, brutally beating the guy into the ground. It seems Eddie liked what he saw and recruited Albert into his organization. McGrath then set him up to run Pier 32 in the North River. His side hustles were truck hijacking, armed robbery, and loan sharking in addition to labor racketeering. He was once convicted of possessing a machine gun and sentenced to 7 to 14 years in prison. He also took a pinch for burglary, robbery, and assault. He was considered a key enforcer on the waterfront. He was a vicious enforcer known for his violent episodes, although what he's most known for doesn't have anything to do with violence. He helped mastermind the most lucrative heist this country has ever seen up to that time in 1934, the Ruble Ice armored truck robbery. With flawless execution, the heist team, consisting of about 13 accomplices, pulled off an armored truck robbery that netted them just shy of $500,000. I'm sure you can just imagine how much money that was in the 1930s. Later, Aki took two younger Irish gangsters under his wings that happened to be cousins, Mickey and Harold Bowers. These two guys were legit tough guys and ruthlessly violent. They were actually brought into the fold of the profitable dock rackets by the big boss man himself, Eddie McGrath, who felt like he needed more muscle to keep order on the docks. These two ruled Hell's Kitchen's piers where the luxury liners docked. Mickey and Harold Bowers ran one of the most profitable branches, Local 824. These guys and their cronies were so violent, their union local earned itself a slick nickname. They were known as the Pistol Local. And there's been instances that if big cruise liners were scheduled to berth at another dock, these guys were known to use their influence to call a strike on the piers, which would delay the sailing of the cruise liner. The strike would continue until the company gave in to the Bowers' demand, and the cruise liner would reschedule to dock at Pier 90, their pier. For years, these Irish gangsters would operate with impunity. They would get away with doing pretty much anything they wanted on the docks. They would hand out beatings whenever they deemed necessary, which eventually became a daily occurrence. Of course, they would have no qualms gunning down rivals either, and then shootings became very common as well. Of course, as with everything, all good things must come to an end. You can't get away with murdering people forever. All these murderers will eventually catch up to both Dunn and Sheridan in a big way. Although these guys had a tight control over the piers, there was one pier that gave them headaches. Pier 51 was run by a man named Andy Hintz, who was an honest man and ran his pier as such. He refused to be bullied, bought, or bribed, even though he had been visited by Cockeyed Dunn and Squint Sheridan to try to make him reconsider. He stood strong and wouldn't compromise. Dunn and Sheridan got with McGrath and told him about the situation and how Hintz was being a pain in the ass. The decision was made. Hintz had to go. Andy would have to be made an example of. On the morning of January 8, 1947, John Cockeyed Dunn, Andrew Squint Sheridan, and former boxer turned enforcer Danny Gentile patiently waited for Hintz to leave his apartment for work. And once he left, he was confronted in the stairwell by Dunn, Sheridan, and Gentile. No words were exchanged, just gunshots. Hintz was shot 6 times and left for dead. Unfortunately for the assassins, the multiple gunshot wounds didn't instantly kill him, and he hung on long enough to identify Dunn as the shooter to his wife. John Dunn was then arrested and brought under guard to Hintz's bedside, where Hintz positively identified him. It would be discovered that Sheridan had been in Florida and traveled back to New York just to take care of the Hintz situation before returning to Florida, where he was arrested by FBI agents. And then Danny Gentile turned himself in not long after. All were charged with attempted murder, but then Andy Hintz finally died on January 29, 1947, and their charges were upgraded to first-degree murder. This was not good for these guys, because New York was in the habit of frying gangsters for murder. At the time, New York State issued a mandatory death sentence for first-degree murder convictions. And when you know it, all 3 got themselves a date with old Sparky. All 3 men were convicted and sentenced to die in Sing Sing's electric chair. After a lengthy appeals process, John Cockeyed Dunn and Andrew Squint Sheridan died by electrocution on July 7, 1949. You can tell the government only really wanted Dunn and Sheridan because Gentile got his death sentence overturned to life without parole. McGrath lost his brother-in-law and his 2 top enforcers to the electric chair, and the government began to turn their attention to the corruption that permeated through the largest port in the world. As law enforcement pressure began to build, McGrath decided to get out of there. He suddenly disappeared from New York, eventually resettling in Miami with claims of retirement. In the end, McGrath had an impressive reign. He secretly influenced the International Longshoremen's Association for about 30 years and became the longest tenured New York City Irish mob boss in modern times, all while having his name barely make the newspapers. McGrath's top protege and on-premise manager, Hughie Mulligan, was right there to fill the power vacuum created by McGrath's departure. Mulligan tried to take things to the next level and build a larger, more formidable organization, one that could rival the Italians. Mulligan maintained ironclad control over the International Longshoremen's Union Local 824. This notorious racket-ridden union local became the gang's acknowledged base of operation, clubhouse, and headquarters. Mulligan was able to spread his tentacles throughout New York. He and his cronies also infiltrated many other union locals, such as the Steamfitters Union and the Theatrical and Stagehands Union. Hughie Mulligan also oversaw a massive bookmaking operation. He turned out to be an expert racketeer and eventually became a powerful mob boss in his own right, heading all criminal activities for the Irish mob in Hell's Kitchen during the 1950s. During his time as the top Irishman in Hell's Kitchen, he mentored a number of young, up-and-coming Irish gangsters, most notably the legendary Jimmy Burke, who would end up clicking up with the Italians. Burke would go on to operate under the banner of the Lucchese family, under family captain Paulie Vario. Another notable apprentice of his was his eventual successor, Mickey Spillane, but his friends called him Mickey. Spillane emerged as a key figure in the neighborhood's Irish-American underworld during the late 50s. Initially working as a numbers runner for local organized crime figures, Spillane settled in under the tutelage of Mulligan and rose through the ranks of the Irish mob. He would progress to burglary, armed robbery, bookmaking, loan sharking, and eventually go on to operate his own gambling rackets. Hughie Mulligan was feeling the heat from law enforcement and the feds were closing in on him. It seems Hughie learned a thing or two from his predecessor because just like McGrath, Mulligan would flee the area before the indictments rolled in. He would eventually move back to Queens and retire from the rackets, handing off control to his protege Spillane as Mickey would step up and assume leadership of the Irish mob based in Hell's Kitchen. Mickey was unique in the fact that he excelled academically, so much so that he skipped 2 grades at the Sacred Heart School in Hell's Kitchen. And at the age of 12, he was awarded a full scholarship to attend Rice High School in Manhattan. Spillane would ultimately abandon his education and leave Rice after 2 years to help take care of his family and support his widowed mother. He eventually decided to try to get some of that quick and easy money that you only get by being a criminal. When he was just 17, he attempted to rob a movie theater. He was spotted by a police officer who tried to intervene, causing Spillane to flee the scene. At the time, New York had a fleeing felon law, which stated that if a cop believes that you just committed a felony and they tell you to stop or freeze and that person refuses and keeps running, that officer is allowed to shoot him. And that's exactly what happened to Spillane. As he ran away from the crime scene, he was shot in the back by the officer. He was taken to the hospital in pretty bad shape but ultimately survived the ordeal, but it cost him 4 years in prison. Once he was released, he dedicated himself to be a full-time hoodlum and became a numbers runner and ended up working for Hughie Mulligan. And then once he took over the rackets left to him by his predecessor, he took measures to strengthen his organization. Spillane was able to merge several Irish crews into one organized entity focused on territorial extortion and gambling and avoiding narcotics distribution to maintain a code of conduct that emphasized business-like operations over indiscriminate violence. This formation marked a shift from the earlier, less structured Irish street dynamics. Spillane's native roots and strategic acumen allowed him to consolidate power in Hell's Kitchen, although the gang structure remained informal, comprised of a core of loyal Irish toughs from the neighborhood who handled enforcement and collections, with Spillane acting as the central arbiter rather than a power-hungry dictator. This type of approach, combined with his movie star good looks, earned him the reputation as a gentleman gangster, prioritizing profitability and neighborhood stability over gratuitous bloodshed. By maintaining a small, agile operation, Spillane's faction effectively deterred Italian incursions, preserving Hell's Kitchen as an Irish enclave in a city dominated by other ethnic mobs. Spillane ran the area with a godfather-like style, sending flowers to neighbors in the hospital and providing turkeys to needy families during Thanksgiving. Mickey's illegal operations were running primarily extortion and gambling enterprises, such as bookmaking and policy, which was inevitably accompanied by loan sharking, which naturally leads to assault. Spillane avoided murder whenever possible, but if the situation called for it, he definitely wouldn't shy away from it. However, among all his criminal activities, the most audacious was his snatch racket. He'd have his guys go kidnap and hold a local businessman, or more commonly, members from another crime organization, for ransom. This was quite lucrative for him, but would ultimately contribute to his eventual downfall. Spillane was able to make a power move early on and combine his name with the most prestigious name in Hell's Kitchen at the time, McManus. Mickey was able to add to his neighborhood prestige and prominence by marrying Maureen McManus, the daughter of the elitist McManus family, which had run the Midtown Democratic Club since 1905. The marriage enhanced his overall profile by injecting a bit of legitimacy into his criminal persona, as the couple was considered the king and queen of Hell's Kitchen. Merging political power with their criminal activity enhanced the Westies' ability to control union jobs and leveled up their labor racketeering as they moved away from the declining waterfront and made a strong push into construction jobs and service work. Spillane's crew infiltrated multiple labor unions, extracting payoffs from contractors in exchange for labor peace. Although for Spillane, it seems that the community's Irish heritage and the neighborhood's loyalties took precedence over money. He diligently enforced the boundaries of Hell's Kitchen by resisting alliances and rejecting lucrative collaborations with Italian mobsters. He would instead fund operations through high-profile kidnappings for ransom, a tactic that netted him significant sums of money but provoked retaliatory tensions. He will soon live to regret one such kidnapping victim of his. John Coonan was a certified public accountant who operated Coonan's Tax Service and provided accounting services to prominent organized crime figures such as Owney Madden. In 1964, Spillane was trying to raise funds, so he sent out his cronies to look for a wise guy to kidnap and hold for ransom. His guys apparently mistook John Coonan for a mob associate and snatched him up off the street, and they just rolled with it due to his underworld connections. During his captivity, he was beaten and pistol whipped before the ransom was eventually paid and Coonan was released. John Coonan was humiliated, embarrassed, battered, and abused, but he's alive and well and just wants to put this behind him. Oh, but not his boy. This sparked a fire in his 17-year-old son, Jimmy. He harbored an intense hatred for Spillane over this ordeal, and it ignited a lifelong vendetta that propelled young Jimmy on a crusade to restore his father's honor. And Jimmy wasn't playing. In retaliation, young Coonan got his hands on a fully automatic machine gun and attempted to ambush Spillane. Jimmy fired the entire magazine at Spillane and his men from a tenement rooftop, but he missed his target and didn't hit anyone. But the message was sent that Jimmy Coonan was not to be taken lightly. For Jimmy, this incident marked his first direct confrontation with the neighborhood's opposing criminal element, which would propel him deeper into street-level crime. Coonan quickly earned a reputation as an unpredictable hothead and helped solidify his standing amongst neighborhood criminals. His father's position as an accountant to the underworld immersed the young Coonan in the local underworld culture from an early age, shaping his familiarity with mob dynamics and the rough-and-tumble environment of Hell's Kitchen. His dad's position blurred the lines between legitimate work and criminal enterprises. It also inadvertently got him acquainted with Hell's Kitchen's seedy underworld, which enabled him to foster an early worldview tolerant of violence as a means of protection and retribution. Nevertheless, Spillane inadvertently launched Jimmy on this quest of retribution, as his life goal is now to take vengeance against Spillane.